Hey everyone, and welcome to Stitching Tales, a podcast about all things sewing and also what it's really like to run a sewing business. I am Johanna Lundström from The Last Stitch.
And I am Malena Hjerpe from Hazelhen Patterns.
And in today's episode, we actually asked AI for suggestions on new topics. And I thought AI did a pretty good job with this one because we have touched upon it in previous episode, but we haven't done a deep dive where we've dedicated an entire topic to. And what is that, you might wonder? Well, it's seam allowance and all things seam allowance. I mean, both why we have them and different width, and of course also that century-old debate on whether or not a pattern should have added seam allowance or if it's better if we add them ourselves. So I think we're going to talk quite a bit about seam allowance when we start talking, because that's what we usually do, right, Malena? When we start talking about, I think, this is going to be a short episode, and then we can...
Yeah, and usually 1 hour later it's like, okay, we gotta go now.
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, because if you, Malena, you work in the garment industry, you're a pattern maker for your day job. And so I'm really curious of how does seam allowance work in the factory setting, and do you add seam allowance when you draft and grade the pattern, or is it done in the factory, or how does all that work?
Well, it depends a little bit, and it has changed during my years, and it depends a little bit depending on the brand that I'm working for and their suppliers. On some patterns or some suppliers, they don't want to have seam allowance because they want to add it themselves. Because it might be because of their machines, and we might not know exactly what their machine requires and how they want to do it. So on some patterns, we actually don't add any seam allowance, because obviously a supplier will do it themselves. There will be seam allowance in the end. And but in most cases, I'm most used to adding seam allowance myself. And then it is usually 1 centimeter that we add on all over, except for the bottom hems or the sleeve hem or something. Then we indicate like how wide do we want the hem to be turned up or folded up. That's a design question, if it's 1.5 centimeter or 3 centimeters or 5 or whatever. But then, yeah, we usually add on seam allowance then. And I mean, usually it's pretty straightforward in the program. It's so easy when you have an actual pattern program, like a specific CAD program for pattern making, then it's like so easy to add on 1 centimeter all over. Of course, you have to do a little bit of adjustment on the corners. For example, if you have angled corners, then you need to manually like fix those if you want some specific angles on them.
Right.
But it is a very straightforward, easy thing to do when you have the pattern programs. But I also guess that even if we add on seam allowance, the suppliers might go in and tweak it a little bit, because we don't know the exact amount that they need for their specific machines. It's really difficult to know exactly the width of the seam allowance that they want. So it's a little bit both in the industry, like you. It depends on on where you are producing your garments, basically.
So you say 1 centimeter is the most common one, and that's 3/4 of an inch. Why is it that the standard, do you think, isn't it wider or smaller? Why do you think it's this exact amount?
Yeah, I mean, if you sew for yourself, or if you go to a tailor or something and you have it tailor-made, then you might have a wider seam allowance because you want to be able to adjust it. If you need to make it the garment a little bit bigger, then you have this wider seam allowance, then you can actually adjust and make the garment bigger. But in the apparel industry, like, we have already tested the garment, we know exactly what it is, how it's supposed to be, and it is you don't want to waste any fabric, so you want to have basically as small seam allowance as possible, so you can fit in as much as possible on the fabric when you cut it out. So it would be a waste to have like extra wide seam allowance, because that will be trimmed down anyway when you sew with the overlock, or if you enclose it in a waistband or something. It's more wasteful. It's not necessary to have that wide seam allowance. So you want to trim it down, and it also can create extra bulk and thickness. So you want to keep it as small as possible, but obviously not too small, because then when the seam is pulled, and depending on the fabric, it might actually, well, not break, but it starts fraying, and the seam will, the fabric will
unravel, basically.
Unravel, yes, exactly.
Right. Yeah.
So that's why you can't have too small seam allowance either. But on more tailored made garments, I don't know what the standard is there. There you might actually have a little bit wider seam allowance. Now I'm just guessing. So you are in the future able to let it out if you want to increase the width, for example. If you have a tailored, then you can also tailor your garment during its lifetime. It's you can adjust it also in a couple of years or something if needed. So I'm guessing now, but there I might think that the seam allowance can be wider if you want to, if you prefer it.
Yeah, and I try to remember. I don't really have any pre-made ready-to-wear suiting or things like that. For instance, since I do a lot of jeans content, for my take there is that the seam allowance is usually about 1 centimeters to 1.2 centimeters, 12 millimeters, so roughly in that area as well. And I agree with you. It's very uncommon to see anything more than that on a ready-to-wear garment. I mean, even dress pants where the seam allowance is pressed apart. It's very rare to see something that is wide as the home sewing seam allowance, which, for reference, traditionally at least, most woven home sewing pattern had a seam allowance of about 1.5 centimeters, which is about 5-8 inches, and that is quite wide. And as you say, Malena, that makes sense if you want to have room to alter your garment, but for functionality, it's not, you don't really have to have it that wide, right? So for instance, if you're drafting your own pattern and want to save fabric, and if you feel confident, there's really no need, right, to have 1.5 centimeters, especially on the side seam. It doesn't, if the side seam is straight, usually it won't cause you any issues, but as soon as you are encountering a curved seam, then you will have problems with those wider seam allowance, and sometimes even 1 centimeters. If the curve is quite curved, it's going to be a bit of an issue, right? So in all the sewing books, you can see that when you're, for instance, adding facing to a neckline, for instance, that's curved, there is suggestions that you do tiny clips in the seam allowance, because that will you can shape the garment so that it's the round shape will be preserved. But whereas if the seam allowance is too wide, there won't be like turning moment. It's limited how to shape the round shape will be more straight. So why, Malena, how should one think about that when it comes to curves and things like that, when you probably shouldn't go as wide?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's going to be a lot trickier to get the seam allowance nice on a curve, because it is more fabric, basically. Depending on what kind of curve for example, if you have a neckline around the curve, and you have it like a facing or something, if you have a really wide seam allowance, that the length of the seam allowance edge is going to be shorter compared to the sewing line length, and then when you turn it and press it, the seam allowance is going to be too short. It's going to start to pull. It's not going to be if you have a stretchy fabric or fabric that you can steam, and you might get by. But if you have a very stiff fabric and a wider seam allowance, it's going to be too short, it's going to start to pull. So that's why you want to cut like almost like notches or small notches basically, or snippets or whatever you say in the seam allowance, so it can actually spread out like a fan basically when you fold it and press it. So then the seam allowance can become longer basically because it has those clipped jacks, what do you call it, I don't know, snippets, like small, you cut with a scissor basically. If you don't, it is gonna be really difficult to get it to lay flat, and the more curved shape it is, the more small places you want to cut it, so it gets like a smooth shape. But you kind of have to do it. Or if you trim down the seam allowance also, so it becomes shorter after you have sewn it, because you don't want to have too small seam allowance in the beginning, because then it's going to be really difficult to sew.
Right.
That's why you might have a little wider seam allowance, and then you might trim it down with for example, there are these scissors that have like a zigzag shape to it. Those are really good to use if you have, for the neckline, for example, if you have a facing, you cut it down to make it more easier to press nicely. And you can also cut, if you do that, you trim down the seam allowance, you can cut them not exactly same width, like you cut them separately and just like a few millimeters like in different length. Then also it doesn't become such a sharp edge when you press it. It's going to be like a little bit like more steps basically. When you press it, it won't show through as easily. So there are a little bit different ways so you can do this.
Yeah, you bring up a good point, because sometimes also if you start with that quite narrow seam allowance, for instance 5 to 6 millimeters, especially if you're working with slippery fabric, there's always a risk that it's hard to keep both sides, both layers, if you're doing a line, because there's a slippery, and the shorter the seam allowance, it's harder it is to control these fabrics. So even though you will probably need to trim it down to say 5 millimeters in order to get that nice shaping, it's definitely might be a better idea to do the trimming afterwards. I've noticed many, because I do
like a nightmare to have a small seam allowance and slippery fabric. It's like,
trust me,
the fabric is gonna slip, and then when you have sewn it, you might actually have, on some places it might actually be that the fabric has moved a little bit, and then you're not catching that fabric part, so you're not actually sewing in the fabric. So you have a little bit of a margin if you have a wider seam allowance. So, and that might also be a good thing if you home sewist work with slippery fabrics. You can have a little bit wider seam allowance there and then trim it down, just because it's easier to work with. If you have two different kind of curves, like you have, for example, in the armhole, when it's both concave and convex curves, and those are gonna match, it is a little bit trickier the wider seam allowance you have, because again, as I said, the curve of the length of the seam allowance edge is going to be different compared to the sewing line length. So it's just going to be a little bit more trickier to pin if the seam allowance is really wide, because it is already then going to start to pull or feel too long. It's going to be difficult to match them. But just if you keep it in mind and pay attention to it, that the seam allowance, those lengths should be matching all the way. It might be easier to work with. But yeah, slipper fabric. Yeah.
And I do that sometimes. Tough. Yeah, I do that sometimes, and I can testify that it is tricky. It's very tricky. So I try to have at least 1 centimeter just because of that, and then I trim it down later on. And also, in my case, I usually use the serger to finish a lot of these seams. So what I do is that I first join both layers together with raw edges, and then I trim away that extra seam allowance when I serge over both layers at the same time. So that's how I deal with it in those narrow seams. And when I do blouses, for instance, as well, I always use 1 centimeter seam allowance. And also, oftentimes in a lot of garments, it's nice to press it apart because it makes it you get that flat feeling. But I would argue that for a lot of times you don't really need to press every seam allowance apart as well. I mean, for instance, in the sleeve area, again, I think that's a good example where you don't really have to have, or it's probably an issue if you have a too wide seam allowance again, because I find that 1 centimeter is definitely enough for me in the sleeve area as well.
Yeah, I think so too. I think wider than that is not going to be necessary. And this is also a reason why if you see on ready-to-wear garment like that has really nice finishes on the inside as well, the side seams and the back seam, and those seams might have a Hong Kong finish or a French seam finish, which means like, I mean, they are not using just an overlock, they are making it a little bit nicer, but they don't do it on the armhole seam because that's a curved seam. And if you have a Hong Kong seam, when you have actually add on binding to the seam allowance, it's just going to be bulky and it's going to be uncomfortable to wear. And a French seam, good luck with getting, again, since the length are different on a curved, it's just going to create a lot of drag lines, like snagging drag lines along the seam allowance. I think that would be, maybe you can get it done, but it's gonna be really difficult. So on those armhole, it's usually just overlock, even on nicer garments. So yeah, because of the curved seam, sometimes it's not any value, like it's actually more harmful to do those nice seam finishes. It's not going to work, basically.
Yeah, because you get the durability with the extra if you also have it. Yeah, that's a very good point. And we haven't talked specifically now about a different type of fabrics, but I would say, generally speaking, there's usually a little bit wider seam allowance if you look at finished garment for woven, and the seam allowance on knit garments is usually a little bit more narrow. And why is that, Malena?
Yeah, I mean, on woven you usually sew first with a straight seam to sew them together, and then you sew an overlock on them, and usually it's a little bit distance between the overlock seam and the straight stitch. So in total, the finished garment is usually 1 centimeter seam allowance, while on jersey garments, knitted fabric garments, if it's cut and sewn, then you still might, again, I don't know how they do it, and different suppliers want different things here. We always add on 1 centimeter seam allowance. I don't know, the supplier might trim it, like remove a little bit based on their machine, but I don't know, here it really depends on the suppliers. But when you work with the jersey fabric, you just sew with the overlocker, so then it's just that overlock seam that is basically the seam allowance, which is like 6 millimeter or something wide. So that's the difference between woven and jersey. And the reason why you don't do the same on woven is the overlock seam is not as durable as a straight stitch. Both the thread is a little bit thinner usually. It's not as good as on a straight stitch. And the actual seam is also, I don't think it's as durable as a straight stitch. That's the most, is more durable basically. So when a woven garment is like when you wear it, it's gonna have a little bit more stress on the seams since the fabric is not stretching. So then you want it to be more durable so the seam won't break basically. So that's why on woven you don't just sew with overlock. You have to have you want that straight regular straight stitch as well.
Yeah, so that makes sense why it's a little bit wider then, because it's double the seams.
Yeah, exactly.
And we actually had a poll when we talked about a bit about that in a previous episode. If you are listening to us on Spotify, we try to add polls not on every episode, but a lot of them. You can see that in the episode. You can see a poll that we have for that week, and we did a poll on this topic because we have I really like those narrow seam allowance on when I'm doing knit pattern. So I like to have a 6 millimeters, which is 1/4 of an inch, and then I just touch just slightly, like skim over the edges, whereas when I'm sewing on a serger. Whereas, of course, if you have a 1 centimeter seam allowance, you're going to have to trim away a couple of millimeters in order to get the same width. And I find that sometimes a little bit hard to gauge when I'm sewing quickly, because I find that on the overlock it's a little bit harder with the seam guide. But we had a poll where we asked you, our dear listeners, what you prefer on knit garments, and it was a question of it was 1 centimeter, 3/4 of an inch versus 6 millimeters, 1/4 of an inch, and the 1 centimeters option won. And and that's what you also do on your own sewing pattern, Malena, and I do on the more dressier one of my sewing patterns, but I have 6 millimeters on my more tight-fitting jersey tops, jersey garments. So it was interesting to see that there was some that voted for the 6 millimeter option as well, but it was interesting to see that is not just the standard, it's also actually the preferred if home sews. But I guess the nightmare would be 1.5 centimeters when you were doing a tight-fitting garment that is made from stretch fabrics or jersey fabric.
Yeah, it would be so difficult to gauge how much you should cut off with the overlocker. And the reason also why I don't want 60 millimeter, it feels like so small, like you have no margins basically.
Exactly.
And the jersey fabric is so easily, like the edges are rolling and rolling basically. So it's just easier to handle, I think, with a little bit wider seam allowance. I mean, it is still narrow, so it's not a lot of wiggle room there.
yeah. And I see that point definitely. And I think the only instance where I think it does create a little bit of a hassle is if you're using if you only have a sewing machine and using the sewing machine overlock stretch stitch, because that is also about 5 millimeters wide. Because that's the max width of a sewing machine, and because the sewing machine can't cut it off, then you need to actually trim away those extra 3 to 4 millimeters in order to use that stitch. So that is the only situation where I can see that it can cause some inconvenience. Then again, I think from what I can tell, a lot of people that gets kind of serious about sewing with knits, they do tend to invest in a serger. So and that then this point is not really necessary, because I assume that for the most part you will use a serger for those stretched side seams.
If you sew on a regular home sewing machine, but you use the overlock stitch or a zigzag or something, and you actually sew to the edge, I find it that the edge is so easily stretched out that it. I have never got it to work very well. The seam doesn't become so nice. It's so easy, that the edge gets stretched or pulled down in the machine. So that's also why I would, even if I sewed with a home sewing machine, I would not stitch actually so the needle goes right beside the edge. I would have it a little bit of distance there, just so it doesn't get tangled in the machine or something. Again, this depends a little bit on the machine and the fabric, obviously, if it's going to be an issue or not. But if you are sewing together edges and you have these issues, you might want to add a little bit wider seam allowance then, just to avoid it, because it can be I have had so many issues with, when the fabric is stretchy and the needle pushes it down. Maybe it's that the needle is not so sharp anymore, or it has been damaged, but it pulls down the fabric into the machine, and then it gets caught in the bobbin thing. So I have had issues.
Yeah, so have I, and I think pretty much anyone. I mean, as we talked about before, you can definitely use your regular sewing machine for a lot of knit projects, but it's not designed to sew with stretchy knits, and because it doesn't have the option of a differential feed that can regulate the speed of the presser feed, there's always a risk that the seams will be stretched out, because it's just doing something. It's not really constructed to do it. We can hack it, but it will work much better on pretty stable knit fabrics. But if you're using really soft, stretchy knits, as Malena describes, there is you will probably have issues when you're using a regular sewing machine. So that's good to know as well. I mean, again, you have to do what you prefer. I think that's important, and that kind of brings me to the second point here. We're going to talk about that before we go into hem allowance. Is that here in Europe, traditionally, back in the olden days, all sewing patterns came without a seam allowance, and whereas today, and especially I think from the US, North America, and also maybe in Britain and other countries, the seam allowance is always added to the pattern. And Malena, I know you have some hot takes on this and the pros and cons of both these methods. So why can it be problematic that the seam allowance are already added to a sewing pattern? And we do that ourselves, we should say also, but you have the options,
No, I have two files for the regular A4 letter-sized file that you print out for yourself. Like, I have the options where it's only seam allowance, and also one option where you can print out both the seam allowance and the sew line, like they are in different layers, so you can turn them on or turn them off, whatever you prefer. But I mean, if you are just gonna cut out the pattern, like no changes, straightforward, then I mean, it's so convenient to have the seam allowance added on. Then you just cut along the pattern edge and you're happy with that. But as soon as if you are going to do any adjustments to the patterns, then you need to think of you should adjust that with the sewing line in mind, because if you add or remove anything, you need to measure how much is it actually added to the sewing line, if it's a curved line, because you need to add the same amount or remove the same amount on the pattern piece that should be matching to it. For example, the armhole, sleeve cap and the armhole, that's like the most common thing if you adjust anything, because those curves, as I had said, they are different, and then the sewing seam allowance length is different, so if you measure those you might get it wrong. You might add too little, too much to the other one. So that's why it's so easier to, and also if you want to know exactly how much you are adding, then it is always the sewing line that you should measure, because the seam allowance, the length there could be a little bit more or a little bit less. We have demonstrated this in our book Fit for Knits. We can add some pictures to our Instagram to showcase this, that there can be a few millimeters off if you are working with the seam allowance edge. So, and for me, it's so much more visual, easier to get a feeling of how much you are adding or removing if you work with the seam, the sewing line, instead of the seam allowance edge. So if you're doing any adjustments, then it's easier, I think, to have this seam line or sewing line visible or work from there. If you are just lengthening a straight pair of pants, I mean, sure, it's no issue. Or lengthening in general is usually quite straightforward. But if you are going to do a little bit more complex adjustment, full bust adjustment, or then it's a little trickier to get everything matching at the end.
Yeah, that's very, very true. And so there are actually pros. So why it might seem like an annoyance that you have to add a seam allowance to certain sewing patterns, there is actually a thought behind that. And of course it also allows you to customize your seam allowance, which we talked about previous here as well, that maybe 1.5 centimeters is just unnecessarily wide and just eats up too much fabric. So then you could skimp it down, but it's also, of course, it adds time and preps. And I should say for background that on my sewing patterns, all my sewing patterns have seam allowance added, so I'm definitely not preaching what I'm saying here. But that's also because that's what the market expects. But you, Malena, as you say, you actually offer both options on your sewing patterns, that one can print them out with or without the seam allowance shown. And because you have to, as you say, Malena, when you're doing alterations, we need to work with the sewing line or the seam line or stitching line. Because that's and it's also very good because as you say, you have to check that when you've done the alteration, that the pieces will join together, and that's impossible because the seam allowance can be much different in length than the actual seam, which is what you're supposed to sew. So yeah, I am definitely not, even though I find a little bit of, I guess once I've gotten a bit older, I mean, because when we grew up, that was the only way we had to do it. So we have different tools and techniques for adding seam allowance. So at times you get a bit more proficient with it, and you find new ways of kind of doing it quite quickly. But it definitely adds more time for prepping. So I definitely understand why pre-added seam allowance has become the standard here in Europe as well. But still, for instance, Birdstyle magazine, which is an old German sewing magazine, they still don't have seam allowance on most of their patterns, at least if they haven't changed it in the last few months. But last time I bought one, it was last year, I don't think there was any seam allowance. And now we just
the danger when the obvious danger when seam allowance is not included is you forget to add it when you cut out the pattern. I mean, that's So I definitely understand that there is must have happened many times because of the confusion. And sometimes I think, for instance, I could be wrong, but I think Birdstyle also have paper patterns or I guess they're mostly digital now, but they are not in the magazine. They're standalone patterns, and I've seen that they've had seam allowance on some of those patterns. So it can be a little bit confusing that as well. You don't really. They might be different depending on which branch of a company that you have. So yeah, definitely, and also I guess, I mean, you are listening to this, so I'm a proficient sewist, but if you don't want to add seam allowance, you can't fix it by just drafting a larger size. I'm just saying that. I'm pretty sure that I in the beginning had. When I felt a little bit overwhelmed, I probably have been guilty of that. Yeah, sounds like a quick fix, but oh no.
There's a science to drafting. No, it doesn't work like that. Yeah, but it can be tempting for sure. But we haven't really talked, you mentioned a little bit how it works in the garment industry, but we haven't really talked about hem allowance as well, because those can of course differ too, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, then it's, I think, more of a design question, like what do you prefer? How wide do you prefer it to be? Of course, there are some technical limitations. If you have, for example, have a full circular skirt, then you have a very rounded hem, then you can't have like a really wide 5 centimeters 2 inches hem allowance, because when you are folding that fabric, again, the outer edge is going to be longer compared to the sewing line. So it's going to be you have to basically create small fold to make it match, so you can't do that. So that's usually why those kind of garments have a pin hem or like a really teeny tiny, as short as possible folded up hem, because then you can avoid that issue. But on, for example, knitwear, you usually have a little bit wider hem allowance, just because when you are sewing too close to the edge, the hem can be easily stretched out, and it's gonna start pointing out and like fold out basically when you wear it. So there you usually want to have a little bit wider hem allowance. I mean, it doesn't have to be a lot, but a little bit wider.
Yeah. What would you say, for instance, for a knit top? What would be your recommendation? We're talking like stretch jersey knit top.
I mean, minimum 1.5. That might be too small. 2 centimeters. I think I have 2.5.
Yeah.
So 1 inch hem allowance.
So rather 1 inch
standard.
than 1 inch than just 5/8.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's usually better, because to avoid it from folding up basically when wearing. But on a woven, I mean, if you want to do it really easy, just overlook the edge, fold it up 1 centimeter, and you are done. I mean, there it's a little bit simpler. If it is more of a straight seam, then it's easier. Usually you fold it twice, just to fold in the raw edge so it doesn't become visible. It's a little bit nicer finish, but you can do, if it is straight on a woven, you can basically decide whatever you prefer to how wide or how narrow it should be. But as soon as it has curves, then a more narrow hem is better to avoid those kind of snagging drag lines. I mean, even if you press a lot, it's never gonna disappear, and after you wash it, it's gonna be visible. So curved hem, then you want to have a wider,
smaller,
more narrow hem.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I think it's a good idea, especially it also depends on the product, of course. I think a good rule of thumb also, as you say, a straight line, you can have a wider hem. A curved line, you should have a more narrow hem, but also the fabric type as well. So for instance, if you are hemming a skirt made with very lightweight, say drapey, rayon or silk or something like that, a narrow hem will be much better and look much nicer. Whereas if you're sewing a skirt in a more stable fabric, a little bit heavier fabric, then you can also go a bit wider on the seam allowance. So I think there's also those kind of things to consider as well, both the shape of the hem and the weight of the fabric.
Yeah, and a good thing also to remember, if you are adding on seam allowance yourself, or when you are looking at a pattern, for example, on quite common on the sleeves or on trousers that have a more tapered, like a chinos or something, tapered legs, like the bottom opening is smaller basically compared to the rest of the garment, that the hem should then be, I mean, it can't just continue on becoming more narrower. The hem, when the hem starts, the seam allowance at the side should go out. So when you fold them up, the seam allowance at the side should be matching, because otherwise when you fold the hem up, it's going to be too short at the side. It's not, when you sew, it's not going to catch it, or if you hem it, it's going to start to pull because it is too short. So that's always something to, if your pattern doesn't have that, be a little bit careful, because those are like very standard, very like basic things that you have to be adjusted on a pattern.
If the pattern is slanted in some way, either tapered in or A-line, because if for instance the skirt is very A-line, then of course the seam allowance will be even wider. The circumference of the edge of the seam allowance will be wider, so then you have to ease stitch that extra fabric. So and if the pants are very tapered, for instance, right, then if the seam allowance is also even more tapered, as you say, you will have problems making, because there is the inside will be too short, right? So you have to stretch out.
Yeah, because when you fold it up, then it's not going to be matching to the longer circumference. And usually on A-line skirts, even if it's quite A-line, it is still straight hem then there, because you usually have it slightly rounded, the bottom hem, just so you still have 90 degrees corner. So when you sew them side seams together, they are still it's a smooth overlapping, or smooth. It's 90 degrees basically. So then when you fold up the hem allowance, it is it's basically straight then. But keep these things in mind if you are adding on seam allowance, that the angle of the hem might be a little bit different compared to the wider the hem, then it's even more important that this one is followed.
So that's a really good, and you have to think about that when you add. And sometimes I did see a suggestions, for instance, when we talk about knit garments, that for instance a sleeve on a knit top, it's usually narrower at the wrist, and then of course you would have the same problem if you again made the hem the same angle, so it's going to be even more narrow. But I saw a suggestion that you could, instead of tapering it out in order to match, you could taper it straight, like a 90-degree angle, because then you can stretch to fit, because you're working with stretchy fabric here, so that you don't really have to angle it out because the fabric is already stretchy. But for instance, if you're doing a woven fabric, then you definitely need to match the angles on a tapered garment, I think. On knitwear you usually get by even if it's not perfectly done, but on woven it's more important. And also sometimes it can be when we talk about angles, if it is, for example, a sleeve that has a cut at the back, like it's a two-piece sleeve, then the back seam at the armhole is going to have very different angles on the top sleeve and the undersleeve. And there you can also, if you are adding seam allowance yourself, keep this in mind, that how the seam allowance actually should be in the corners. Right.
You basically think of it, if you do it in paper and you are matching up the pattern pieces, and which direction do you want to fold the seam allowance when the garment is done, then the whole seam allowance should be caught in the other seam allowance when you are sewing it. So depending on which direction you want to fold the seam allowance, this might look different than compared to how you want to add on with to the corners. It's not, if this is not added, or you just they meet wherever they meet. It's not going to look as nice. It's going to be a little bit more tricky to sew because the seam allowance might not be catch for
instance,
when you sew the next
right?
seam.
So because if the seam allowance is too slanting downwards, that edge might be underneath the seam line of the sleeve, for instance.
Exactly.
And I think we're going to post that as well on our Instagram account, if we can find example of this on our Stitching Tales pod Instagram account, and to see. And that goes for princess seams as well. So for instance, on my cardigan, the AV cardigan pattern, which you helped me draft, Malena, so those are slanted also, so they go together nicely. And that, because that's very easy, again, because you just want to follow the angle. That's the intuition intuition when you add the seam allowance. But as you say, it's going to end up too far down sometimes, so there will be a gap. And sometimes you, for instance, if you're doing maybe those two-piece sleeves or a princess seam, you might want to top stitch it as well, and then again you want to make sure that you have a seam allowance to stitch over the entire way as well, so it doesn't get off and a little bit, because it can.
Yeah, exactly.
So
and
very
also
good
it can
point.
be in the shoulder seam. On a knitted, like a jersey, t-shirt, whatever, it might not be so obvious or visible, but for example, the neckline front and neckline back, I mean, they have a little bit different angles, and then if the seam allowance are just made like pointy, like they just meet wherever they meet, that corner might also be a little bit less wide or more wide, or like longer or shorter. So then when you are pinning them together, you might start to pin the seam allowance outer corners together, but those are not the actual that should be meeting. It is the sewing line edge, like that should be meeting. So that could also be a little bit confusing when you are pinning together and start to sew, that it doesn't look like they are exactly the same length. And then this could also be like helped out if the seam allowance there have just a 90-degree angles, so you can actually match up the corners of the seam allowance. This is something that I did not care about when I drafted my own patterns and sewed for myself when I added on seam allowance, because I always knew that it is the sewing lines that should be matching. It is that corner, so I always, adjusted to when I pinned it, like I knew where they should be matching. But if you're not really used to it, it could be a little bit confusing that if you are matching the outer corner of the seam allowance, then the length are like, it's a couple of millimeters we are talking about, but still, like, why is it not matching? Well, it's because those should not be matching. It's the seam allowance, like where that line begins. It's that corner that should be matching. I'm going to try to see if I have some pictures of this as well. I think we actually have talked about this in a future previous
I think you posted
episode,
something
because
similar.
I have like memories of like I have.
I know. I think
some
you've shown
not
this.
pretty sketches.
There was
on
a
this to
paper or something like
illustrate
that you
it.
pinned.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
Yeah, and it's a good
try
tip
to
here
dig them up again.
to put a pin in the intersection of the seam allowance on both,
Exactly,
so you can see that where they intersect. So that's where. So you don't worry if the edges aren't aligned, because you have to align that particular spot, that corner, and that's where your guide, where you're gonna make sure that the pieces are good. Because as you say, those kind of seams, they do add a little bit more confusion. I think that's why it's so important to have this topic, especially if you draft your own patterns, or if the pattern maker didn't use this method to ensure, and of course also if you have add seam allowance yourself or draft your patterns. I mean, those are really good things to know, because it's a little bit annoying when you realize, and I've definitely done this myself when I've done princess seams and things like that, and then think about how the two layers of fabric should align and make sure that everything is catched. So I definitely had to, like, sometimes when I sew the armhole, I had to like pull up the edges just to make sure that the machine catched it for sure. So,
and I mean, if you are sewing with jersey and you have just 6 millimeters seam allowance, you're barely not even gonna notice this. I mean, it's not gonna be an issue. But if you are sewing with woven that is very like shirt fabric, poplin fabric, like that doesn't have like any stretch in it, like it's a little bit more on the stiffer side, and you have wider seam allowance, 1.5, you are gonna notice this. It is gonna be like, why are they not like, it is gonna be more visible then. So it depends a little bit on the garment type and the fabric also, if you're gonna see these things or not.
Definitely, but it's good to know at least that we're gonna try to post it, so you can, I guess it's a little bit abstract unless you're familiar with these particular type of methods, which is not what most of us do, but we all sooner or later will run into a princess seam or a two-piece sleeve, especially if you're making like a jacket, a suiting jacket or things like that, because they usually have split seams to give a better shape, for instance. So it's definitely not an uncommon thing to encounter after you've sewn for a bit.
No, and it also might be, I mean, for me, for example, when I did my first PDF pattern, I mean, this was not new, but like I didn't think as a home sewist, as a customer, what they really want, because that was not familiar for me, because I work in the sewing garment industry, and then, for example, with the angle of the shoulder seam, like that's kind of thing that everybody knows how to do it. Like it's not that important. Like you know, it's so standard. But then, like, okay, but how for the customer? If you are a first-time sewist, you should not have an issue. I don't want you to have an issue or question about my pattern. So that's why, I mean, I want to adapt on these kind of things, so the customer is actually like, this is crystal clear, no questions. I don't need to be an experienced sewist to know how to figure these things out. Like, you want to remove all those potential question marks.
Yeah.
And one thing we mentioned, for example, when you have, so the neckline, you stitch and turn, and you cut snippets into it so it stresses out nicely. You can do the opposite depending on, I mean, if you, for example, are sewing a pocket that has rounded corners, then you stitch and turn, but the seam allowance are like squished together.
Yeah, right.
So then it's like
too much fabric. Yep, exactly.
Yeah, in one place, exactly. In those rounded corners. So then you can do not the opposite. You still cut, but you cut away a little bit of the fabric. So when they are like squished together, since you are removing a little bit of fabric, it will have space. It will not be laying on top of each other, creating folds. So that could be also a tip if you are doing those kind of corners, to cut away a little bit. Basically cut like small V's into
so you
the
can kind
seam
of
allowance.
Overlap them, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
So you can, yeah, exactly. You remove that extra fabric, and then when you shape it again, or the edges that you, those V shaped cuts that you describe, they will be joined together and basically create that curve on the inside of the seam allowance. So that's a very good tip as well.
How do you do it on your, since I have a little experience in sewing jeans, like the back pocket, which is like a patch pocket sewn on top of, then you have usually a corned, well, you have very sharp corners.
Right.
Do you cut away there as well?
No, I don't really,
but
I use a very like narrow seam allowance. I don't really think it's necessary. But if I would do, and also the fabric is quite thick, but if I would do patch pocket in a more lighter fabric or things like that, would it be a bit more visible, that extra, because sometimes it's going to show through depending on the fabric, then I would definitely trim away a little bit and try to shape it as you describe it. So it depends a little bit on how important the finishing is and how the fabric works. But so in my case, I just overlap that, and I find that with the top stitching and everything, it lies pretty flat, and it's not really visible from the outside, that overlap.
No, it's easier, I think, because it's more squared corners.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it's more trickier if you have like a rounded.
You will often see that bunched fabric underneath.
Yeah.
It's going to be visible because it's quite, especially depending on the curve. But if the curve is quite pronounced, you will have a lot of extra fabric, especially if the seam allowance is a little bit wider for sure, and that can definitely alter the finished. So that's a good point as well. I didn't think about that, but that's those little tricks that do make a big difference. Yeah, and if you do, I mean, these, if you have a patch pockets, for example, with rounded, I mean, a pocket that is just sewn on to a garment and that has rounded corners, it is really tricky to get like smooth curve. So a little bit side topic here, but one way of doing it could also be to actually sew, how do you say? A straight stitch with longer stitch length, and you pull it together basically to create, I mean, you gather it the same way as you gather a sleeve head to get the ease spread out nicely. You can do that on corners as well, because then you gather the fabric evenly, so then you can get the rounded shape more nicely. Then I don't think you need to maybe not cut away, as I explained earlier, but then it is more, it depends a little bit. Thinner fabric, maybe, as it might show through,
I think you need to test here to see what's best method for your specific fabric, but also to have the pattern piece, cut away the seam allowance, use that as a template when you press the pocket to like press the seam allowance over the pocket. Have it as a template.
Like a present template. That you shape it.
Present template. Yeah, it's
then
so much easier then.
Yeah, and then you can just figure it out if you need to remove some of that extra fabric before you stitch it. And it's going to be quite obvious, and it all depends on the project and the fabric and the curve and everything like that. But it's good to know. I think this is a little bit more advanced skill, but it's definitely good to know because it is a little bit tricky to do those round-shaped patch pockets.
Yeah, I mean, usually it become like basically very small straight angles and uneven, and it can be really tricky. So you can't just do that on the fly, just pin and sew. You have to do a little bit of press work, either with pressing or with that gathering thread to make it evenly round. It is really it is tricky.
Yeah, one of the trickiest thing I've sewn is I think it's called maybe bluff pockets. I made I'm gonna post a picture on this episode as well. I did a more tailored jacket which had rounded patch pockets, but they were no top stitching, so they had to be like sewn with a kind of invisible slip stitching and had these really pronounced round curves. And that was super tricky. So I mean, when you don't, it's even more difficult to control the shape of the pockets when you didn't have a top stitch. You have to hand sew everything. So that was a tricky. And I think there's a way. I think in the garment industry you use like a zigzag stitch and you try to catch it. But the trick is basically to have a patch pocket with no visible outer seam. I think it's called bluff pocket or something like that. It's a thing.
Yeah. Sounds complicated.
Yeah. I hope that having covered pretty much everything now, because as we suspected, we managed to go over now.
Again,
almost an hour.
Yeah, almost 1 hour already. Yeah, no, but just one last thing. When you have like collars, for example, or the waistband, or like when the seam allowance are going to be enclosed, usually you have 1 centimeter there because you don't want to have too much fabric.
No, good
inside.
points.
It will just be thick and not useful. While you don't be afraid to add extra seam allowance on your garments and leave it for the side seam, for example. If in the future, if you want to add on a little bit extra width or something, it's really difficult to do that if you have a tiny seam allowance. But if you have a little bit extra seam allowance, it's so much easier to do that. I mean, we mentioned this already also in previous episode, that on tailored men's pants, you usually have quite wide seam allowance at the center back. Yeah. And also the waistband, it's sewn like a split. It's not...
It's
so you can so easily...
Yeah, it's not one single one waistband. It's
exactly.
pieces together, so you can alter the entire side seam and the entire back crotch seam. Yeah, it's fascinating
so easier to add on width to the back seam then.
Yeah, because the crotch is usually, the seam allowance is kind of tapered, so it's...
Exactly, it's like 3 centimeters
really
wide at the top and 1 centimeter
of the waistband,
at the bottom.
right?
Yeah.
So if you have looked inside a pair of pants and wonder what this odd seam allowance is, that's definitely... So it's a great tip to add longevity to your garments. If and that's also one reason for not overcasting both layers at the same time, because then you of course remove the option. So that's a cause for pressing the seam allowance apart, especially on pants. And
I mean, you can do that also if you enclose that on the side seam, for example. Then you just unravel the straight stitch and sew it a little bit wider, I mean closer to the seam allowance. So I mean, it's possible there as well. So I mean, you can be flexible and decide, as long as you know what you're doing, you can do whatever when you're sewing your own garments.
Yeah, and if you listen to this podcast, hopefully you know what you're doing.
Hopefully we gave you some tips and tricks on the way.
Yeah, this was such a fun episode to do, and thank you AI for suggesting it. Full transparency, and we didn't come up with this idea ourselves, but it's always good to get new input. And if you have any other topic suggestions for us, you can definitely contact on our socials. You can find us on Stitching Tales Pod on Instagram, and Stitching Tales Pod is the video version on YouTube. And of course, you can email us at stitchingtalespod@gmail.com. All right then. Well, thank you so much for listening. I am Johanna Lundström, and you can find me at thelaststitch.com, and you can also start checking out my YouTube channel again, because I've been posting videos lately, at least 2,
Yay!
and more to come on my other YouTube channel, The Last Stitch TV. And who are you?
My name is Malena Hjerpe, and you can find me at hazelhenpatterns.com or on Instagram at Hazelhen Patterns.
Awesome. Well, we talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.